This is the moment the United States lost the room. Not gradually, not quietly, all at once. If you look at the United Nations General Hall this morning, you will not see America standing with its allies. You will see America standing alone, in silence, while Turkey, China, Russia, France, Germany, and nearly every nation in the European Union voted together on the same side of a resolution calling for an immediate, unconditional ceasefire in Gaza and formal recognition of Palestinian statehood. As of 9:47 a.m. Thursday, April 16, 2026, the vote passed with 143 nations in favor. The United States cast one of only 4 votes against it. The other 3, small island nations most people couldn't find on a map, and Washington, the most powerful government on earth, has had nothing to say. No press conference, no emergency briefing, no statement from the Secretary of State, just silence. Israel, already facing war crimes proceedings at the International Court of Justice, an arms embargo from the European Union, and a full diplomatic freeze from Turkey, has just been abandoned by the last structure that was supposed to protect it, the informal Western consensus that held for 70 years. In this deep dive, we are going to walk through exactly how this happened, who made it happen, what Washington knew and didn't do, and what comes next for every American who thinks this is just a story about the Middle East. It is not just a story about the Middle East. This is a story about whether America still leads the world, or whether the world has simply moved on without us. 2 years ago, the United States had a plan. The plan was simple: hold the alliance, manage the pressure, keep Israel shielded at the UN, while quiet negotiations pushed toward a 2-state solution behind closed doors. American diplomats were in the room. American credibility was the currency. It was supposed to buy time. It was supposed to prevent exactly this moment. But the cost was not just political patience. The cost was moral authority. Every time America vetoed a ceasefire resolution, the world took a photograph. Every time Washington sent another weapons package while civilian death tolls climbed past 50,000, then 80,000, then beyond, the photograph got clearer. And other governments that were once quiet, started asking their own populations a very uncomfortable question. How long do we stand next to this? Turkey answered first. President Erdogan suspended all trade with Israel in May of 2024. What started as an economic protest became something much bigger. Erdogan didn't just close his ports, he started making phone calls to Beijing, to Moscow, to Brussels, to Pretoria. He was building something. The European streets started shifting next. Mass protests in Berlin, Paris, Amsterdam, Madrid. Governments that once whispered their discomfort started saying it out loud in parliament. And Washington kept telling them, hold the line, trust the process, give diplomacy time. They gave it time, and nothing happened. America gambled that the alliance was permanent, that shared history and shared institutions meant shared silence. It assumed the world would wait indefinitely. It assumed wrong. At 6:15 a.m. this morning, before most of Washington had finished its first cup of coffee, the Chinese Foreign Ministry released a joint statement. It had 14 signatures on it: Turkey, China, Russia, France, Germany, Spain, Belgium, South Africa, Brazil, Malaysia, Indonesia, Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. Read that list again. France and Germany, America's oldest NATO partners, signed a document alongside Russia and China calling American policy on Gaza a historic failure of moral leadership. Pause. 14 nations, including 2 NATO members, aligned with Moscow and Beijing, against Washington. On the record. While that statement was being read in every foreign ministry on the planet, the European Parliament was also voting, passing a resolution suspending the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which governs trade and cooperation between Europe and Israel. That agreement has been in place since 2000. In one morning, it was gone. And at that exact same moment, sources inside the UN compound confirmed to 3 separate international outlets that the United States ambassador had been given advance notice of the vote count and was told, not asked, told, by the German ambassador, "You should consider abstaining. You will not want to be on the record this way." America voted no anyway. The euro dropped 0.8% against the dollar within the hour. Not because of the vote itself, but because markets read the breakdown in Western coordination as a structural shock. U.S. Treasury yields ticked up. Gold jumped $44 in a single session. The bond market was whispering what the diplomats hadn't yet said out loud. Something just broke. While global markets were reacting, Turkey's President Erdogan was landing in Beijing for what his office called a previously scheduled bilateral visit. It was not previously scheduled. It was arranged 72 hours ago. The agenda, according to leaks from Turkish diplomatic sources, includes a new framework for a parallel international security structure, one that does not include the United States, not a replacement for the UN, something alongside it, something new. And most shockingly, a senior European diplomat, speaking anonymously to a major French news outlet, said this: Washington had 6 months of warnings, at least 6 months. They chose not to act. We cannot keep waiting for a response that is not coming. 6 months of warnings and no response. According to leaks from diplomatic sources inside Brussels, an emergency call took place at 11 p.m. last Tuesday, 3 days before today's vote. The participants, the German Chancellor, the French President, the EU Foreign Policy Chief, and the Turkish Foreign Minister. The topic: whether to proceed with the joint statement regardless of American objections. We have learned from sources familiar with the call that the German Chancellor asked directly, "What do we say to Washington?" The response from the French side was blunt. "We have been saying things to Washington for 18 months. It is time to say something to the world." The decision was made that night. The statement would go forward. The UN vote would go forward. America would be informed, not consulted. It was a cold, calculated political decision. They looked at the 2024 U.S. election, which confirmed an administration they viewed as unwilling to apply real pressure on Israel. They looked at the arms flow, which continued even as the ICJ issued provisional measures. They looked at veto after veto in the Security Council, and they realized America had become a blocker, not a broker. The decision was made: go around Washington entirely. Sources inside the State Department describe a building that was, in the words of one official, completely flat-footed. There was no contingency plan for this scenario, no draft statement, no emergency call from the Secretary of State to European counterparts. The diplomatic machinery that is supposed to respond to moments like this was simply not running. One senior official reportedly asked, "Do we even have a position?" They did not. Why did this happen? Follow the paralysis. For 2 years, American foreign policy on Israel operated on a single assumption: that the relationship was too important to pressure and that the alliance was too strong to fracture. Both assumptions collapsed this morning. The power in this situation has shifted, visibly, measurably, from Washington to a new informal coalition centered in Ankara and Beijing. Erdogan has spent 18 months positioning himself as the moral voice of the global South on this issue. He now has China's economic weight and Russia's diplomatic cover behind him. And Europe, tired of being lectured about values by an administration it no longer trusts, has stepped into that coalition rather than resist it. America can no longer call this a fringe movement. 143 nations is not a fringe. It is the world. The legal dimension here is also significant. The International Court of Justice's ongoing genocide case against Israel places every government that continues active military support in a complicated legal position. Several European legal advisors have warned their governments that continued arms transfers could expose officials to accessory liability under international humanitarian law. That is not a hypothetical. That is why Germany froze new arms licenses to Israel in January of this year. Analysts are already calling this the most significant rupture in the Western alliance since the 2003 Iraq War. But this is different from Iraq. In 2003, the split was between the U.S. and parts of Europe. This time, the split is between the U.S. and virtually everyone, including partners in the Gulf, in Asia, and inside NATO itself. This isn't a policy disagreement. This is a legitimacy crisis. Here is the domino effect. If America cannot rebuild its diplomatic position in the next 60 days, the UN vote becomes a precedent. If it becomes a precedent, other issues, Taiwan, Ukraine, trade, will be decided by this same coalition without American input. If that happens, the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency, which depends entirely on global trust in American institutional stability, comes under real pressure. We are looking at a slow unwinding of everything the post-World War II order was built on, and foreign capitals are watching very carefully. Beijing sees an America that is isolated, distracted, and unable to build consensus even with its closest allies. That is not a threat to China. That is an invitation. Moscow, under sanctions and excluded from Western institutions, suddenly finds itself in a majority coalition at the UN. That changes the cost-benefit calculation for every country that was on the fence about engaging with Russia. Where is the American response? Silence. The White House has not issued a statement as of this morning. The State Department website has not been updated. No senator has called a hearing. No emergency session has been convened. Silence. This has created a fracture inside the foreign policy establishment that will not heal quickly. On one side, career diplomats, former ambassadors, and senior military officials who have spent decades building the alliances that just broke. They are furious, and several are speaking privately to journalists. On the other side, the political operation inside the White House that believes the domestic base does not care about multilateral institutions and that international isolation carries no electoral cost. A divided foreign policy establishment cannot protect American interests. It cannot even agree on what those interests are. And inside Israel, reports from 3 separate international correspondents describe a government in genuine shock. The assumption in Jerusalem was always that American protection was unconditional. This morning, that assumption ended. The silence coming out of Washington isn't just a communication failure, it's a symbol. It represents the end of something that Americans mostly took for granted. The idea that when the world faced a hard question, it would look to Washington for the answer. For 70 years, that was not a boast. It was simply a fact. This morning, 143 nations looked somewhere else. You can manage a news cycle. You cannot manage a vote count. You can spin a press conference. You cannot spin 143 flags in favor and 4 against. Reality does not follow the communication strategy. Reality showed up this morning at the UN, and it did not wait for a statement from the press secretary. So where are we right now? America is diplomatically isolated on the single most watched conflict in the world. Its closest European partners have moved without it. Its rivals have used its paralysis to build a new coalition. And its political leadership has so far offered nothing. Not a plan, not a pivot, not even an acknowledgement that something historic just happened. The administration still controls the veto in the Security Council, but the Security Council just became less relevant this morning. That is the paradox. America holds the most powerful formal tool in international diplomacy, and yet finds itself more powerless than at any point since the end of the Cold War. In the weeks ahead, expect the administration to attempt to reframe this as foreign interference in American policy. It will likely try to punish 1 or 2 smaller nations economically to demonstrate leverage. It may attempt a new peace proposal to recapture the initiative, but what cannot be undone is the vote. What cannot be rebuilt overnight is credibility. When France and Germany sign their names next to Russia and China on a statement criticizing American leadership, there is no press release that puts that back in the box. The coalition that protected the post-war order that held through the Cold War, through 9/11, through Iraq, did not break because of one vote. It broke because of 18 months of decisions that told every ally, quietly and then loudly, that American leadership was not available on this question. And now the question is whether American leadership will be available on the next one. That is what the next 60 days are going to answer. That is what every government on earth is watching for right now. Not a speech, not a tweet, an actual decision, an actual response. Pay attention, because what happens in the next 60 days will shape the international order for the next 20 years. This is not background noise. This is the main event. Stay with us. We will break every development as it happens. Watch closely.